Chapter 22 of the Romance of Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sarah Lorenowich. The Romance of Piracy by Edward Keble CHATTERTON. Chapter 22, Smith and the Pirate Schooner. With saddened gaze, Smith watched his old ship fade away into the invisible. There was but little wind, the sea was wonderfully calm, and a thick fog came up, which swallowed the wake of the Zephyr from his vision. In the whole of the Western Hemisphere, there was no more miserable man alive at that moment than Aaron Smith. His ship had gone, his expectation of reaching England was torn from him, and his very life was liable to be taken away from him by force at any minute. He had no thought now for anything else than suicide. The pirate captain knew this, but it was not convenient for him to forfeit so able a seaman. He had other work for him to do yet, and threatened that should Smith attempt self-destruction, he should be lashed to one of the schooner's guns and there left to perish slowly of hunger. At daylight the next morning, the schooner got under way, and after proceeding in a southwest direction, anchored in 2 fathoms in a beautiful harbor called Rio Medias. It is from this point that the second part of Smith's interesting story really begins. Arrived in this delightful anchorage, the schooner could afford to remain some time, and the pirate informed Smith that he expected a good many visitors on board, including 2 or 3 magistrates with their families. The Englishman ventured the remark that he wondered the pirate was not afraid of magistrates coming on board a ship of that notoriety, but the pirate merely laughed and suggested that Smith did not understand the Spanish character. Presents of coffee, he explained, and other little things will always ensure their friendship, and from them I receive intelligence of all that occurs at the Havana, and know every hostile measure in time enough to guard against it. Before long, the visitors came aboard, and the pirate, with something of the grand manner of an old-time Spaniard, received the ladies and gentlemen on his ship with great ceremony. Smith was brought forward and presented as an interesting English prisoner, and attracted more than a little attention. It is customary, with the Spanish-American people, to conclude such social visits as this with a dance. Smith had little heart for such frivolity, but in small as in great matters he had no alternative but to obey, and was selected to dance with one of the daughters of a magistrate. However, in spite of the enforced pleasure, he must have made himself singularly affable, for before the festivities had concluded, the lady and the Englishman had become more than mere acquaintances to each other. Womanlike, she began by taking pity on the European sailor, displayed unwonted interest in his story, and determined to do her best to get him released. Mere pity and interest gave place to affection, but the utmost precaution and stealth had to be exercised, lest the pirate captain, or any individual member of his crew, should so much as have the faintest suspicion that a plot for escape was being planned. The surname of the lady Smith did not learn, but her Christian name was Seraphina. She was a pretty brunette with sparkling eyes and a kind, benevolent nature. In the monotony of her West Indian life, the advent of Aaron Smith had been as that of a person from another planet. The stories which she had learned of London had now the chance of being confirmed or refuted. She inquired eagerly about the grandeur of England's metropolis, and asked naively what sort of a building the immense church was that everybody went to see. A fresh interest had thus entered into her life. A man from the Eastern Hemisphere, a robust English sailor with all the romance clinging thereto which an emotional Latin temperament was capable of conjuring up. But to the matter-of-fact mind of Aaron Smith, all this embarrassing concern on the part of Seraphina suggested nothing less than treachery. It was difficult to believe that this was not part of the pirate captain's plot to entrap him, but the suspicion haunted him only at the first, and before long he was destined to find in the lady his best friend and commiserator. It would have been patent to any careful observer that these 2 individuals had fallen into that condition which is known as love at first sight. The guests departed in due course, and the more serious business of the sojourn in that port was got in hand. The coffee and the other portions of the cargo which had been taken from the Zephyr were now unloaded and sold to the natives. This took some time and was spread over some days, varied by carousels and dancing. There was no lack of refreshment, and instead of everyone helping himself with his fingers, as had been the case when first the schooner had been encountered, everybody was supplied with knives and forks and spoons, which had been pillaged from the English brig. The wine flowed immoderately, and as usual, most of the crew were soon in a state of intoxication. The sale of the cargo was proceeding, but as the men were flushed with wine, it was not long before two of the crew fell to quarreling. High words were followed by a fierce duel with knives, and the sight was sickening. One of the combatants collapsed to the ground with a dull thud, severely stabbed in his left breast. For some unexplained reason, the crew of the pirate ship had in their minds the fixed idea that Smith was something of a doctor, and during the whole of his captivity no protestations of his could uproot that conviction. Probably he knew as many useful first-aid remedies as any average sailor of the early 19th century, and he was endowed with all the resource which a seaman usually possesses. Otherwise, he had no expert knowledge of medicine or of surgery. And yet, as we shall see before we come to the end of our story, it was this imaginary healing power which rendered him of the very greatest service. It fell to Smith's lot, then, from the first, to attend on the sick among his other duties, and in spite of his medical ignorance, he was ordered to see to the wounded man, to staunch the blood and dress the horrible wound. When the injured man had recovered sufficiently to be able to converse, he sent a message begging the captain to come and see him, and then he told his tale. The cause of the quarrel, said he, was because his antagonist formed one of the party that was bent on assassinating the captain and crew. That being accomplished, they would then possess the ship and enrich themselves with the plunder. The man with whom he had been fighting had now gone to Havana in order that he might get together more men to further his purpose. The pirate captain listened to the story with every attention, and was beside himself with rage that one of his own men should so far have dared to plot against him. Vowing certain destruction of them all, he summoned the crew on deck and informed them of the news. So soon as they had heard it, the entire ship's company rushed madly below to where the suspected man was lying, dragged the fellow from his bunk onto the deck, cut off his legs and arms with a blunt hatchet, gashed at his body with their knives, and then threw his half-dead remains overboard into the sea. The next morning, Smith was sent aloft to bend a new fore-topsail, and about noon, a ship being descried in the distance, he was told to report as to what sort of vessel she might be. Looking through his spyglass, Smith replied that she was a schooner standing to the westward. "Is she a merchant or a man of war?" yelled the captain from the deck. "Mind you don't deceive me," he threatened, "for if you do, I will cut off your head. I have already killed several of your countrymen, and take care you don't add yourself to the number." This made Smith doubly cautious, but at last, being certain in his mind, he reported her as a merchantman. Already the pirate had got under way, and the receipt of these welcome tidings caused him to give chase. Smith remained aloft, and observed that the merchantman had now guessed the pirate's intention, and was altering her course to the nor'and. Smith passed the information at once below, but the only thanks he got was abuse from the skipper for not having informed him sooner. The sails filled to the meager breeze as the pirate ship slowly sped onward, but when they had cleared the reef outside, the pirate ordered the sweeps out, and with this auxiliary the ship began to travel fast over the smooth surface. Before long, the lazy breeze began to stir, and soon both vessels were standing on under a smart press of canvas. For several hours the chase continued, and before dark the corsair was gaining rapidly. But she was yet a long way off, and the pirate much feared that she might escape, as she would assuredly alter her course during the night. At 10 p.m. the merchantman was well out of sight, and Smith was ordered below. The pirate then issued his instructions, and remarked that he would keep on that tack until 2 a.m., and if the vessel was not then visible, he would alter his course to the east. Meanwhile Smith, tired out with being tossed about while aloft, slept soundly until he was called. On coming on deck, he found that everyone was utterly at a loss to know the ship's position. Of any efficient navigation there had been practically nothing. The whole crew had been drunk, there had been no light in the binnacle, no log had been thrown to ascertain the ship's speed, so it was impossible to guess the distance traveled during the past night. The pirate, therefore, called upon Smith to help. Smith answered very properly that it was impossible to say exactly their position, whereupon the unscientific captain threatened him with instant death if he could not give the required information. Smith could not make an impossibility possible, and answered, "If you will wait till noon," he explained, "I will endeavor to do so." And the same threat was repeated in case he should fail to achieve this. But Smith was certainly lucky for once in his varied life, for, as he said at a later date, at this time the sun was in distance with the moon, and the sky being remarkably clear, the sea smooth, and the schooner making very little way, I had an opportunity at about 9 o'clock to take a good lunar observation. So, after taking the sights, no one else on board had any knowledge of navigation, in fact, knew nothing better than seamanship and pilotage. He worked out his calculations and was able to find the true latitude when, to his great surprise, he discovered they were 60 miles west-northwest of Cape Buenavista, or 200 miles west of the position Smith had imagined. The captain was informed of the position, who ordered Smith to direct the helmsman to the proper course and to have the sails trimmed accordingly. He questioned Smith as to when they would pick up the land, and the Englishman answered that if the wind was favorable, they ought to do so in the afternoon. The captain demurred somewhat, then declared with an oath that if they did not then sight land, he would punish Smith. Fortunately, the breeze now freshened and became freer. Smith was nervously wondering whether he had made an error in his calculations, but at 4 p.m., to his great relief, the lookout man cried, "Land!" This happily ended Smith's suspense, and the schooner's coast pilot complimented him on his skill, but the captain had nothing to say except abuse. "You rascal," he cried, "you pretended not to know where the vessel was, but you see you cannot deceive me, and I would advise you not to attempt it." They had held on an easterly course for some time, until at length they had come to an anchorage where they let go, and the following day proceeded into the harbor. While they were lying to their anchor, a boat full of men was observed to be approaching the ship. As they came on, it was seen to contain some of the men who, according to the man who had been wounded in that duel already narrated, had been plotting against the captain. The pirate was roused to fury on seeing him, and declared he would kill the lot of them. Then, ordering 30 muskets to be brought on deck, he awaited developments. When the boat got within about 200 yards, the men therein ceased rowing and held up a white handkerchief as a signal for peace. This was answered by a similar signal from the schooner, and thus encouraged the men to lay to their oars again and pull towards the ship. But they had not rowed many more strokes before the pirate gave orders to fire on the boat, and so deadly was the effect at such close range that of the 6 men, 5 fell dead to the bottom of the boat, while the 6th leapt into the water and began to swim. But it was no part of the pirate's intention to allow this man to escape, and, dispatching a boat after him, the fellow was soon hauled from the sea and brought aboard the schooner. From that moment began a series of cruelties and inhuman tortures of which it is difficult to write calmly. The captain commenced by remarking that he was well aware of the share which this survivor had in the plot that had been detected. Admonishing him to confess, he warned him that if he should not reveal the whole truth, he would give him a cruel and lingering death. In vain did the terrified man protest his innocence, whereupon the captain had him stripped and exposed, naked and bleeding from the wounds already received, to the scorching heat of a West Indian July sun. Agony was piled on agony, and the captain showed no hint of mercy. Smith, with great courage and human feeling, entreated that the man might not be tortured so dreadfully, but the captain threatened him, too, with severest vengeance for his interference. Then addressing himself to the suffering wretch, the pirate announced that he was now about to put him to death, and advised him to prepare his soul for departure. Once more the man protested his innocence and begged for his life, but unavailingly. The next stage of terror began. Being placed in a boat, he was pinioned and his body lashed to the stern. 5 men were told off to go in the boat in addition to Smith. "You shall now see how we punish rascals," exclaimed the captain, as he gave orders to the Englishmen, with the further instruction that the men were to row backwards and forwards up and down the narrow creek for the space of 3 hours. This creek was formed by a small strip of water that separated Cuba from a desert island. I will see, exulted the brute, whether the mosquitoes and the sandflies will not make him confess. It was a brutal, inhumane form of torture, worthy only of such a captain. The broiling sun shone fiercely on the warm sea. In the shade, the thermometer registered as high as 90 degrees, and from the side of the creek a waste of swamps was swarming with insects of a venomous and numerous kind. These settled in scores on the body of the pinioned man, and sent him almost delirious with pain. His suffering body began to swell, and he became blistered from head to foot, a ghastly sight for his beholders. Now and again, in his agony, he besought the boat's crew to put him out of his misery, but all save the Englishmen laughed him to scorn, and even imitated his heart-rending cries. After a while, owing to the solar heat and the stings of the mosquitoes and sandflies, his face became so swollen that he was utterly unrecognizable. His voice began to fail, and his life was ebbing fast. Smith had, from the first, believed that the story of the alleged conspiracy was false, and that it had been invented out of revenge by the man who had received the thrust of the knife. Unable to endure this loathsome sight any longer, the Englishmen, believing fully in the man's innocence, at length prevailed on the crew to let the victim die in peace. They consented to go round to the other side of the island, where they would be secure from the captain's observation, untie the man, and put something over him to shelter from the violent rays of the sun. So they rowed to the spot, and laying upon their oars, set him loose. But as soon as he felt the sea breeze on his parched face, he fainted right away. Then they decided to tie him up as before, lest they might incur the fury of the captain for their lenience, and pulling back to the schooner, they returned their prisoner. Instead of inspiring any feelings of pity, the sight of the moribund man caused the schooner's crew to break out into derisive laughter. As for the captain, he was disappointed that the fellow had not yielded any confession, and, turning to Smith, asked if he could now cure him of his ills. The Englishman replied that the man was actually dying. "Then he shall have some more of it before he dies," was the pirate's sharp answer. So the victim was left in the boat, and the latter was moored within a few yards of the ship. 6 of the schooner's crew were ordered to take their muskets and to fire at the wretch. This was done, but when they went to examine the body, they were surprised to find him still breathing. So a pig of iron was fastened round his neck, and he was cast into the sea, lucky to be freed from any further variety of torture. Then music broke out on the schooner's deck, and, with the callousness of the most hardened criminals, the guitars tinkled and songs were indulged in, just as if nothing had happened to disturb their equanimity. It is no pleasure to have to chronicle such incidents as these, which detract from the more romantic side of piracy at sea, but it would be as unfair to paint only the glamour of these rovers as it would be to select merely the harsh cruelties which they imposed. While I can see little that is edifying in parading repellent details of blood and slaughter, yet it is part of one's duty to give some indication of the lengths to which these miscreants allowed themselves to go. There are those who would do away with the too practical and unromantic steamship. There are those who would scrap the navies of the world. Yet if all this were done, we should soon find the seas become once more the happy sphere for pirates, and a recrudescence of robberies and cruelties would result. The person who is forever laudator temporis acti, and while seeing nothing worthy of his praise except what he is pleased to call the good old days, is the very individual who would have objected strongly to live in the insanatory houses of our forefathers, who would have protested most strongly against the inconveniences of a protracted voyage in a sailing ship at the mercy of headwinds, pirates, and scurvy. It is too often that distance, coupled with a highly romantic temperament, which makes a page of black history appear with unwarranted attractiveness. In the story of the pirates, there would be little to entertain us were we not able to feel that in this prosaic 20th century we are at least free from the scourge of the sea. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of The Romance of Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Romance of Piracy by Edward Keble CHATTERTON. Chapter 23. Plot and Counterplot. On the day following the incident of the above murder, Smith was busy on deck making a new gaff topsail for the schooner, when the cry came from the lookout man, "A sail! A sail!" Well knowing that the Englishman was the most reliable of all his crew, the captain at once sent Smith aloft to scan the sea as the schooner was got under way. Smith reported that the vessel in sight was a merchant brig, whereupon orders were given to go in pursuit. Ordered to return to the deck, the Englishman's advice was sought as to the best mode of fighting the brig in case she should resist. And while the schooner's pilot was occupied in taking the ship out to the open sea through the intricate channel, Smith was set to devise some suitable strategy. The pirate ship was not long in gaining on the brig, and having come up to within a short distance, fired a gun and hoisted Spanish colors. This the brig answered by heaving to and displaying the British ensign. It should be mentioned that the brig rig was not confined to ships of the merchant service, but that the Royal Navy had similar vessels on its list. Let it be remembered that in those days of hemp and canvas there was not the smart distinction between a ship of war and a ship of commerce that there is today. No one in this present year of grace could possibly mistake a liner for a battleship, but a brig of the early 19th century might be naval or mercantile. Some of the merchant ships carried guns for self-defense, and there was very little to distinguish them from the government vessels. And in those days the red ensign had not yet been entirely abandoned by the Navy to the use of merchant craft. Therefore, we can well understand that when the schooner came near to this brig, the latter's painted ports and her smart figurehead caused the pirate to hesitate and to wonder whether this was not a man-of-war. If she were, then the contest would not be likely to favor the schooner. But he was by no means certain, and being still a safe distance off, he ordered the fore topsail of his schooner to be laid aback and hove to. By that time he was rather inclined to think the brig was after all a merchantman, and so, calling Smith, he informed him of the intention to send a boat to board her under the Englishman's directions. This announcement greatly alarmed the latter, and he pointed out that should he be captured, it would be an ignominious death for a British sailor. As usual, when any of his orders were likely to be disobeyed, the pirate became furiously incensed. "And what are you, sir," he taunted, "that you should not suffer as well as myself? The schooner shall never be captured, for when I can no longer defend her, I shall blow her up. If you do not instantly go," he threatened, "I will shoot you." Smith knew that the pirate was a man who used no idle threats, and yet for an English sailor to attack an English ship was an unthinkable proposition. "You may shoot me if you please," was his brave answer, "but I will not commit an act that might subject me and my family to disgrace." The pirate now realized that Smith was as determined as he, and resort must be made to the measures which had been already employed so profitably. He therefore commanded his crew to blindfold Smith, to have him taken forward, and told the man himself to prepare for death. After a time, the pirate came to Smith, and asked him if he were now ready for death. "Yes," answered the man courageously and firmly. No sooner had this word been uttered than a sharp volley of musketry rang out. But Smith was not shot. The captain's intention had been merely to strike terror into his brave heart. It was a great trial to his nerves, but the man never flinched from his resolution. The pirate, knowing how invaluable Smith had become to the efficient working of the ship, was reluctant to lose him, but for all that he was determined to break his independent spirit. Coming up to him after the firing of the volley, he inquired of the Englishman as to whether he were not seriously wounded. In answering in the negative, Smith begged that if it was the captain's intention to destroy him, he would not trifle with him. "Death I prefer to disgrace," said he, but the pirate was adamant. The next command was to lash Smith to the mainmast, and to remove the bandage from his eyes. The captain himself could be seen cutting up a number of cartridges, and the powder he placed around Smith by his feet on deck. A train was laid, and then the ship's cook was ordered to light a match and send it aft. Once more the pirate gave Smith a chance, but again the firm answer was returned. A terrific explosion ensued. Flames leapt into the air and encircled the man who preferred death to dishonor. Up and up blazed the fire, and, with his hands pinioned, he could do nothing to relieve himself of his sufferings. His cries of pain were met with ridicule, and the captain tauntingly, and, like the veritable bully that he was, inquired of him, "Will you now obey me?" But there is a limit to human suffering, though many a man, both before and after that incident, has endured the flame to the end. It is in no wise a disgrace if Smith in his excruciating agony at length yielded to the pirate, and at length, acquiescence being extorted by the vilest form of torture, Smith gave in and was ordered to be released. There are few acts which a virile man, and especially a sailor, hates more than to faint, and yet so grievous had been his sufferings that the Englishman promptly lost consciousness. Some of the crew carried him down below, and when he came to, he found himself stretched on a mattress in the cabin with a racking pain that gave him no respite. In his frenzy and delirium, he meditated self-destruction, and begged the steward to lend him his knife for a moment. He, however, like the sneaking cur that was so characteristic of this Dago crew, straightway went to inform the captain, who came below in another of his furious tempers. "You want to kill yourself, young man, I understand," was his salutation. "But I do not mean that you should die yet. I shall blow you up again, for I see it is the only way to make you obey me." But, happily, the threat was not immediately put into execution. Frankly, it was the intention of the pirate that his most useful man should regain his health as quickly as possible. Smith's wounds were dressed, and the cook, who was the one man who seemed to have any sympathy, made Smith's bed for him. The latter was in great pain, but was able to converse. He learned that by now the schooner had returned to her anchorage, for the pirate had eventually been so convinced that the brig was a man of war, and that Smith had intended to decoy the corsair into the hands of the British, that an attack on the brig had been deemed inadvisable. So immediately after Smith had been taken below, the schooner had headed for harbor. The cook, at least, had the courage of his convictions, and openly expressed his opinion of the pirate captain as a man of the worst character, adding that the latter had already killed over 20 people with his own hand. Meanwhile, the master of a coasting schooner, who had entered the harbor, brought news that the Zephyr had arrived at Havana, and announced the circumstances of her capture by the schooner. The pirate captain, on the receipt of this intelligence, and remembering that he had admonished Lumsden not to call at Havana, was beside himself with rage. Rushing into the cabin where the sick man lay, he exclaimed to Smith, "See what dependence can be placed on your countrymen. That old rascal has gone to the Havana and broken a solemn promise. But this will be a lesson to me not to trust the English again, for I now find them as treacherous as the Americans. He thinks," proceeded the pirate with increasing anger, he is out of my reach. But, mark me, if he remains a few days longer at the Havana, he shall never live to see England. I have 3 or 4 already on the watch to assassinate him." And the pirate usually carried out his threats of vengeance. That same evening, while the crew were at their evening meal, accompanied by the usual carousing and guitar playing, the merriment was suddenly brought to a halt by the sound of approaching oars. Instantly the men were sent to quarters, and every man stood in readiness to open fire. The boat was hailed in Spanish, and a Spanish voice returned the hail. The oarsmen were allowed to come alongside, and informed the captain that some more of the original members of the crew, who were accomplices of the man that had been accused of plotting, had now arrived, and were prepared to revenge the deaths of those men whom the captain had killed in the creek, as already narrated. Now, it should be mentioned at once that, following out his threat to have Lumsden assassinated, the pirate captain had already sent at least one man, whose name was Stromeda, overland to Havana. This man was to procure a horse and to hurry to the port, so that he might arrive before the Zephyr had cleared. This intention had reached the ears of the late members of the pirate's crew, and they in turn vowed, as a means of partially revenging themselves, to kill the man now on his way to Havana. The story is indeed varied by so much plotting and counterplot that it is not easy to unravel the main narrative. However, the receipt of this news caused great consternation among the schooner's crew, and to show how little, for their own part, they sympathized with any mutineers, 10 of the ship's company now volunteered to go ashore to protect the man hurrying towards Havana. The captain thoroughly approved of the suggestion, and well supplied with arms and ammunition, the party set forth. The oars dug into the water, and the boat advanced to the shore. About midnight, the boat returned to the schooner, and the captain was informed that on the beach they had met a servant dispatched post-haste from the magistrate, whom we have already mentioned as the father of Serafina. This gentleman sent information that Stromeda was already a prisoner and about to be put to death. The captain was further informed that on hearing this news, the men from the schooner had taken a circuitous route through the wood, had eluded the scouts of the mutinous gang that were seeking to kill Stromeda, and had surprised 4 of this gang while busy under a tree playing cards and drinking. These 4 men they had captured, and had next proceeded to the magistrate's house, into which they had fired their muskets through the doors and windows, and discharged their blunderbusses. The precise object of this action was difficult to ascertain, unless they had expected that other mutineers were there hiding, and they had, quite unintentionally, wounded the magistrate. But they found Stromeda lying bound hand and foot, and having released him, the latter was able to resume his journey to Havana. It was found that 2 of the mutineers' party had been killed, 2 more were taken prisoners, and 2 others, acting as scouts, had escaped after wounding one of the schooner's crew. Smith was approaching convalescence, but he was yet far from recovered. All the time that he had been lying on his bed of sickness, many a thought had passed through his mind, many a longing to escape from this life as an involuntary pirate. Many times, too, he had thought of Serafina, and of her promise that if she could assist his escape, she would fly with him to England. The accident to the magistrate was now the means of Smith having opportunity to see Serafina once again. Were the circumstance not true and actual, one would have called the incident a rather far-fetched coincidence, but I have already emphasized the fact that this is no fiction. It was policy for the pirate captain and the magistrate to render every assistance to each other. Their aims and ambitions were in many respects identical. Therefore, On learning of the latter's injury, Smith, still supposed to possess a unique medical ability, was sent to dress the magistrate's wounds. The Englishman himself had not yet recovered from his own injuries, so, reclining on a mattress with one of the ship's hatches underneath, he was transferred to a boat and rowed ashore. No time had been wasted, for it was now only 2 a.m. For most of 3 miles, Smith was carried on the back of a horse, through a forest, until they arrived at the house of the magistrate. Having been carried into the house, the first sight to greet him was Seraphina, who, rushing to his embrace, cried, "Take me, for they have just killed my father." With this announcement, she burst into tears. Smith was taken to the room where the magistrate was lying, attended by the latter's wife. "Oh, my dear mother," exclaimed Seraphina, "this is the good Englishman who has come to cure my father." For in spite of the lady's lack of logic, the magistrate was not wounded mortally. Lying stretched out on his bed covered with blood, he presented a sorry spectacle none the less. Lying on another bed was another man who had also been wounded during the same incident. It was seen that the magistrate's arm had been fractured by a ball which had passed through his shoulder and lodged in his arm. With no little skill, Smith succeeded in extracting this ball and then proceeded to bind up the wound. Exhausted with his labors, Smith was afterwards allowed to recline in another room, and Seraphina, full of gratitude, came to attend on him. It had been some time since their first meeting, and the unfortunate accident to the magistrate had thus brought them together once again. On many an occasion, Smith, during the period intervening, had been planning some means of escape, and now away from the schooner he was able to relate the experiences through which he had recently passed. He reminded the lady of her promise and her affection, to which she replied in terms which left no possible doubt in Smith's mind. "I have resolved," she answered, "to accompany you, and will remove every obstacle in the best way I can. But caution is necessary. You must therefore be patient." A little later, and the time came for Smith to be carried down by the pirates to the beach. Night had vanished, and it was now broad daylight. Arrived back on the schooner, Smith found that this was not to be the last of such visits, as the pirate captain regularly sent him ashore to heal the magistrate's wounds on other occasions. On each of these visits, Smith was able to obtain interviews with Seraphina, and to advance further their plans for flight. She had made every preparation, she said, to escape to England in his company. "I have arranged all," she went on. "The guide is in readiness, and it only remains for us to fix the time and find the opportunity." Many schemes were proposed, and as many rejected, until at length it was agreed that Smith should come over late in the second evening, under the pretence of performing some essential surgical operation on the magistrate. It was resolved that in the meantime she should have the horses and guide waiting a short distance away. The best laid schemes of lovers, however, sometimes work out badly, for the guide proved to be treacherous, informed Seraphina's father and mother, and had it not been for the consummate skill of Seraphina herself in turning this accusation against the accuser, serious complications would have ensued. As it was, nothing worse happened than the loss of the $50 with which the guide had been paid in advance. But on board the schooner, the pirate captain was beginning to chafe a little at the magistrate's continued illness, and declared that as soon as Smith's services could possibly be dispensed with, the Englishman was to be put to death. For there was a possibility that if he escaped, his knowledge, which he had now obtained of the channels through the dangerous reefs, would enable any English man of war to find her way into the harbor of the pirate. The captain's suspicions of a plot for Smith's escape had begun to take definite shape, and henceforth he resolved that even if it were necessary for the magistrate to be attended by Smith, the former should, in the future, be brought off to the schooner instead of Smith going ashore. Stromeda, who had been able to reach Havana in safety and to return to the schooner, came back with tidings which depressed the pirate captain. He had done his best to carry out the work of assassination, but, unfortunately for him, the brig with Lumsden on board had already left Havana before Stromeda had reached there. So, life on the pirate ship returned to its normal state. Smith was regaining his strength, but he had not lost anything of his intention to escape if chance should present itself. One day, whilst at anchor, a sail was descried in the offing, and the captain made her out to be an English brig with full quarters and the familiar white streak which was so much favoured in those days. The schooner was got under way, and the deck cleared for action. Meanwhile, the gunner informed Smith that there were not enough cartridges made up for a long action in case the stranger should keep up a resistance. So the Englishman set to work to make some more. Before this had been done, a second English brig was seen. As the schooner continued to chase the first of these craft, which took not the slightest notice of the corsair, although the latter fired several guns and hoisted American colors, the captain was fuming with rage. The chase kept on until the schooner's long gun was shotted and fired. This at last produced the desired effect, and the brig hove to. The schooner then hauled down the American colors, which the pirate had hoisted, and showed a red flag in their place. A boat was lowered from the schooner, 6 armed men, a pilot, and Smith being sent away in her, for the latter had no thoughts again of resisting. But Smith was strictly enjoined to hold no conversation with the brig's crew or captain, and the pilot was instructed to throw the brig's skipper overboard, then tack the craft towards the shore and send Smith back to the schooner. However, Smith persuaded the pilot to disobey that mandate. On reaching the brig, the latter's captain met the pirates at the gangway and inquired who they were, to which question nothing but an evasive answer was given. The brig was tacked towards the land, and then, the corsair firing a musket, Smith was ordered to tell the captain and crew to get in a boat and proceed on board the schooner. End of chapter 23. Recording by Linda Johnson. Chapter 24 of The Romance of Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Romance of Piracy by Keble CHATTERTON. Chapter 24. Chance and Circumstance. The brig's skipper had been eyeing Smith for some time and now claimed acquaintance. But although his face was familiar to Smith, he could not guess the former's name. It surprised the brig's captain to be told this was a pirate ship, and on reaching the corsair's deck and being asked in a rough tone for his name, Smith heard the name Cook, and then recollected that he was slightly acquainted with the mariner. With more than a little tact, he now claimed Cook as his cousin, and begged the pirate that he would not maltreat him. In this request Smith succeeded, on condition that Cook gave information as to what amount of money and cargo the brig had on board. Thereupon the man handed Smith the bills of lading, from which it was seen that the ship carried nothing but rum. Cook was questioned as to the other brig still in sight, and replied that she was either a transport with troops on board, or else she was the brig Victoria, from Black River, Jamaica. He thought more probably She was the former, but on taking another look at her, changed his opinion in favor of the Vittoria. Chase was therefore given. Now, the name of Cook's ship was the Industry, and her crew were at once employed on board the schooner and ordered to the Corsair's guns. Rapidly, the Vittoria was overhauled, and now the long gun was fired across her bows, which the brig answered by hoisting her colors and backing her mainyard. Smith and a pilot were sent aboard her. The brig's officers and part of her crew were, as before, sent off to the schooner, and the newest capture was steered to follow the Corsair as she ran into the land near Cape Blanco. But a change in the weather came, and instead of the clear, bright atmosphere, there followed a dense haze with rain. There was for a time almost a panic on the prize as the breeze freshened and the ship sped on, for suddenly, immediately astern, out of the mist, appeared another schooner, coming up fast and in the wake of the Corsair. The man at the wheel was a bad steersman and sheered the vessel about a good deal. As the wind was free, steering sails were set by the pilot's instructions in order to get away from the pursuer. One of the pirate's crew was pacing the deck with rage and in a state of nervousness, lest the stranger should be a man of war. He cursed the steersman for his bad helmsmanship, and this only made the sailor more confused, and to steer a more erratic course than before. The Corsair therefore turned round upon Smith, and swore that if the latter did not make the helmsman handle the ship better, he would take his knife and kill the Englishman. Smith accordingly did what he could, and later on in the day, as the weather fined down, the stranger was seen, with great relief to the pirate, to be no ship of war. Indeed, it was chiefly the Corsair's bad helmsmanship which made it seem that any chase was occurring. Every hour Smith's hopes for escape were being accentuated by a treatment that was barely endurable. One of the projects that now arose in his mind was a daring scheme, embracing the intention of killing the pilot and the other members of the schooner's crew, and then take the ship to New Orleans. To have cheated the schooner's captain of the Vittoria would have been a fine thing, for the rest of the brig's crew would certainly have assisted Smith. However, the Corsair's skipper was far too wide awake for any game of that sort, and at dusk the Corsair's gunner was sent aboard the Vittoria, while Smith was ordered back to the schooner. The prisoners were sent below into the hold, and sentries placed on the hatchways, making escape impossible. All three ships had come to anchor outside the reef, consisting of the Corsair, the Industry, and the Vittoria. But later on, Captain Cook was permitted to get the Industry under way, as her cargo of rum was not deemed worth the Corsair's attention. The Vittoria and the schooner, however, proceeded towards Rio Omedia, for the Vittoria's cargo of coffee was distinctly worth having. The schooner was certainly no dull sailor, and on the way she outran the Vittoria by a long distance and soon reached her port. Hour after hour went by, and as the Vittoria had not arrived the next morning, the pirate began to be anxious. A few hours later, a boat was seen rowing towards the schooner, containing that portion of the pirate's crew that had been left aboard the Vittoria, so it was then presumed on board the schooner that the brig had been recaptured and then abandoned. But what had happened was that, on sighting again the ship seen the day before, which had been supposed to be a man of war, they had become panic-stricken, and, fearful of being captured prisoners, had preferred to run the Vittoria onto the reef and abandon her. The reader will rightly imagine that this information did not please the choleric Corsair. But a little later on, the Vittoria was lightened of her cargo, floated off the reef, and taken into Rio Medias, where also the pirate schooner arrived. There is reason to believe that the British Admiralty was somewhat remiss in those days in their duty of policing the seas of the West Indies, having regard to the number of pirates which were known to harass British shipping. It even became a joke among the pirates, who would laughingly remark that naval officers preferred to spend their time amusing themselves at Havana rather than seek out these wasps of the sea. However, as it happened, just when the Victoria had been floated and taken into harbor, the Jamaica fleet was observed under sail, and once more the pirates were afflicted with nerves. They therefore deemed it best to make the poor Victoria resemble a wreck, and she was for a second time drawn up onto the outer edge of the reef. Smith, for his own part, was smarting under the British neglect which could tolerate this sort of thing, for at the head of the Jamaica fleet he could espy a British man-of-war, and although she was passing within a league of the Victoria and the schooner, yet no notice was taken of either. The pirates waited till the fleet had passed on their way, and then once more the Victoria was hauled off the reef and taken to a mud-bank. A couple of coasting vessels arrived from Havana, and speedily unloaded into their holds the rest of the Victoria's coffee, to the great profit of the schooner's captain. A week later, the schooner was joined in harbor by the arrival of another piratical schooner, whose skipper asserted that he had successfully plundered 3 British ships. No one who has any knowledge of the depredations that were carried on at this time can deny that the life of a sea robber was, if exciting, at least remunerative to the interested parties. Like the old smugglers, the work was carried on in a business-like manner, with capitalists at the back of the concern. The principle on which this systematic piracy was conducted may be described as follows. The corsair captain would agree with the owner of the ship to put guns, muskets, and everything else necessary on board the pirate ship. This would be done with secrecy at Havana, and the owner was probably a supposedly respectable citizen. The ship would then put to sea in charge of a master on the pretense that she was bound for a neighboring port. But when night came on, she would let go anchor not many miles farther on and close to the shore. The corsair captain would now row off to her, take over the command, and send the master ashore. As soon as the latter reached Havana, the owner would complain to the governor that while his ship was at sea, she was attacked by pirates and seized. The master would then be brought as a witness to prove this assertion, and the story would be generally believed. And as it was known beforehand that the naval authorities would not show much activity, the owner might content himself with the knowledge that his ship was away earning handsome dividends as a pirate without interference on the part of the government ships. But on rare occasions the latter did bestir themselves, and it happened that whilst Smith was captive on board the schooner in Rio Medias, news came that the governor of Havana was about to adopt hostile measures against the pirates. Lumsden's narrative had not improbably something to do with this, and it was reported that 5 gunboats were to come down inside the reef within the next 5 days, and the magistrate, Serafina's father, was ordered to render every assistance in his power. It should be mentioned that although the magistrate had up till now been visiting the schooner to have his wounds dressed in the cabin by Smith, yet the latter was no longer allowed ashore, and now that the schooner's captain had been told by the magistrate this warning news of the approaching naval advent, the former deemed it best to put to sea and cruise in the vicinity of Cape St. Antonio for an indefinite period. The visits of the magistrate had become even more frequent, since, in acting out his double life, he must needs keep the corsair fully up to date regarding the movements of the gunboats. Serafina also used to come on board with him, and was able to smuggle the intelligence to Smith that the plans for escape were being pressed forward and a new guide had been engaged. The reader will like to know what became of the ill-starred Victoria before we pass on. This fine ship, after being so badly used and ignominiously cast upon reef or mudbank, was now taken in hand by the magistrate, who, fearing that her presence when the gunboats visited Rio Medias might provoke awkward questions, had her destroyed. But in the meantime a change was coming over the schooner, and something important was about to happen. First of all, a certain amount of ill feeling began to arise, generated by the suspicion that the pirate captain had secreted large sums of money for himself in the sharing of the prizes. The ship was therefore cleft into two discordant parties, and the differences were only settled by the arrival from Havana of the two owners of the ship, or capitalists. But still a more important incident occurred which has a potent influence on the rest of Smith's career. For at last the pirate captain himself fell ill and was attacked by fever. It is significant in everyday life that he who is a bully is also a coward, and this brutish man who had terrorized and tortured others was now positively frightened that he would die. The pirate therefore sent for Smith, and such was his fear of succumbing that he promised the Englishman his liberty if he should succeed in curing him. But Smith had lived too long aboard the schooner to have much trust in any promise from a man of that character, and he resolved to take whatever advantage he could of this illness to make his escape, so long hoped for and planned, a reality. With no little resource, then, the Englishman insisted on confining the pirate to his cabin. The next afternoon it chanced that a couple of fishermen came aboard and exchanged their cargo of fish for a consignment of spirits, and as the evening turned out wet and stormy, they decided to remain on board. The time was spent very pleasantly with the pirate crew, and there was no lack of alcohol. As the evening went on, every man became intoxicated, and so the watch was neglected. Smith realized that here at last was his grand opportunity. The only watchful man aboard was the fever-stricken captain. So, in order to settle him, Smith, in preparing the sick man's mess of arrowroot, was careful this time to add a quantity of opiate. He also caused him to drink a liberal amount of wine. The result was that at midnight the captain was fast asleep. Quietly and carefully Smith crept up on deck. There was no one there. Everyone was deeply wrapped in slumber. There was not a sound anywhere except the roar of the sea, the howling of the wind in the rigging, and the slatting of the rain against the ship. It was a dirty night, with not a star visible in the whole heaven, but the angry storm-rent clouds scudding across the arc. Smith seized his bag, into which he had been careful to place his navigating instruments and some biscuit. Then, once more, he mounted the companion ladder with the stealth of a cat, and crept aft to the schooner's stern, where the fisherman's canoe was made fast. With his heart thumping inside him and in trepidation, lest the slightest noise might betray him, he let himself down the painter into the canoe, cut the rope, and, in order to avoid making a sound, allowed the craft to drift for some way with the current. When once so far away as to be beyond hearing, he got the little ship trimmed, set the sail, and began to steer for where he imagined Havana lay. Then, committing himself to God, he held on his course as the frail craft sped on through the darkness. Next morning he found himself 40 miles away from the schooner's anchorage, so already he had obtained a fair start. Throughout the whole day it blew from the southwest, which was a fair wind, and this was supremely fortunate, for in those regions a breeze from that point of the compass is rare. All day long, and through the following night, he was sailing, and never a ship, pirate, or merchant, or man of war came into sight. With many an anxious look over his shoulder, he glanced astern to see if he were being followed, but no sail came into sight. There was a big sea running, and it was an adventurous voyage for so small a packet, but Smith was no novice at seamanship. Night and day did he keep her at it, and then, on his second morning out, at 6 o'clock, he came running into the port of Havana, very fatigued with the nervous and physical strain, but a free man again, and safe. As he was entering, his eyes fell on a schooner lying in the harbor. A man was walking the deck whose face Smith knew. Running alongside, he found it was a Captain Williams, with whom he had been acquainted in America some years before. So, in a few minutes, Smith was allowed to clamber on board, received a hearty welcome, and was refreshed with food. Then he turned in for a sleep, and, feeling better thereafter, proceeded ashore. But he had not gone far, when whom should he encounter but one of the crew belonging to the pirate. So soon as the latter saw Smith, he rushed off, and presently returned with a Spanish officer and a guard of soldiers, who promptly arrested Smith as a pirate. The reader will instantly realize that the schooner's captain had, on hearing of Smith's escape, taken measures to be avenged, and the distance could be covered from Rio Medias to Havana as well by land as by sea. But after such an exciting passage in a small boat, the meeting was sheer bad luck for the Englishmen. The officer had Smith thrown into prison, and for 2 days he was kept in a dark dungeon, and then brought before the judge. An interpreter named Payne was employed, who proved to be an unprincipled Irishman. He told Smith that Lumsden had already made every particular known, but at this juncture the harbour-master came forward and declared that Lumsden had stated that Smith was detained forcibly. The result was that, after a few weeks' detention, Smith was brought before the governor and subsequently surrendered to the British admiral of the Jamaica station. The rest of the story is quickly told. Had this been romance and not real life, it should have ended by Smith meeting again with Seraphina, marrying her and living happily ever after. As a fact, he never saw that lady since the occasion when we last mentioned her. After being taken on board the flagship Cybele, the ship eventually crossed the Atlantic and arrived off the Isle of Wight. He was now put into irons again, and in the same ship continued his voyage to Deptford. Thence he was sent to London and examined before the magistrate of the Thames Police Court, who committed Smith to Newgate. On the 19th of December, 1823, he was tried before the High Court of Admiralty on a charge of piracy, with seizing the ship Victoria, the property of Hyman Cohen and others, and stealing 636 barrels of coffee, value £5,000, and 100 barrels of coffee, value £1,000, and also with seizing the ship Industry on the high seas on 7th August, 1822. Several seamen and other witnesses were called by the prosecution, who deposed to the active part Smith had taken in their capture. Smith, in his defense, detailed the compulsory nature of his piratical actions, and declared that he would never have partaken in the unlawful booty had it been within his choice. He recounted with much feeling the circumstances of his captivity and the tortures which he had been forced to endure. He also called about 20 witnesses, who testified to his bravery and humanity and excellent character generally. Among these were Captain Hayes, commander of the ship on which Smith had for some time been mate; also his brother, John Smith, an officer in the Royal Navy; but a Miss Sophia Knight, a prepossessing lady, who stated that she had for some time past been engaged to marry Aaron Smith, went into the witness box. This lady's charm of manner, together with her attacks of bitter weeping, which also affected the prisoner, so overcame the jury that they acquitted Smith, so that if he had been prevented from marrying Seraphina, he was now free to fall into the arms of Sophia. Subsequently, Smith went to sea again, but before doing so, he wrote an account of his amazing adventures, to justify himself in the eyes of the world, and to prove that he was no pirate. This narrative appeared in the year 1824, and it is from his own story that I have taken this account of a real romance among the pirates of the sea. End of chapter 24. Recording by Linda Johnson. Chapter 25 of The Romance of Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Romance of Piracy by Keble CHATTERTON. Chapter 25. The Cruise of the Defensor de Pedro. In the year 1827, a vessel called the Defensor de Pedro was being fitted out at Buenos Aires for a voyage to the coast of Africa, whence she intended to obtain slaves and then smuggle them across the Atlantic into America. This trade of fetching Negroes from West Africa to America was no new departure. It had been in vogue ever since the 16th century, and our own Hawkins, in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, had, to his discredit, been engaged in the same disgraceful traffic. Even though we are writing in this present instance of the early 19th century, the practice had not been discarded. The South American Portuguese had at that time the privilege of dealing in slaves on a certain part of the African coast, but it was the intention of the captain of the Defensor de Pedro to run farther down so that he might purchase slaves at a much cheaper price. Among the crew which he shipped from Buenos Aires were the very scum of the Latin races. French, Spanish, Portuguese, and others of the very worst character came aboard, and among them was one arch-fiend named Benito de Soto, who had been born in a small village near Corunna in Galicia. He had taken to the sea as his occupation, and so, in the year of which we are speaking, he had found himself in Buenos Aires. The ship and her crew of desperadoes crossed the Atlantic and duly arrived off the African coast, where a large number of slaves were shipped. In order to complete his cargo, the captain went ashore, leaving the mate in charge of the ship. This mate was a villain of the most pronounced type, a man of reckless and ungovernable temperament. Seeing that in De Soto there was a kindred spirit, he proposed to the latter a plan for seizing the ship and making off with her. De Soto cordially agreed. The suggestion was now put before the rest of the crew, and after going about the matter in a cautious manner, they had so influenced 22 of them as to promise to join in the plan. But the other 18 declined to be won over, in spite of threats and persuasions. The mate began to despair, but De Soto, acting on his own initiative, collected all the arms of the ship together, summoned the conspirators, and handed to each a brace of pistols and a cutlass, having armed himself in a similar manner. He then advanced to the head of the gang, drew his sword, and declared the mate to be the head of the ship, and the confederates part owners. And when the resistors still held out, he ordered the ship's boat to be hoisted out, and then dramatically pointed to the land and cried, "There is the African coast. This is our ship. One or other must be chosen by every man on board within 5 minutes." Still declining to submit, the 18 got into the boat one by one. Only one pair of oars had been allowed them, and as the ship was now at sea 10 miles from the shore, they would in any case have had a hard row. At the time when they left the ship, the weather was calm and fine, but soon afterwards a heavy gale sprang up, and there was the full force of the heavy Atlantic Sea to be encountered, with night coming on, and there can be little doubt that the boat never reached land, but foundered in the terrible seas. The Defensor de Pedro, with her sails well bellied to the wind, rolled and plunged through the dark night. Outside, the gale howled through the rigging, and all the fiends of storm seemed to have been let loose that night. So it was below in the 'tween decks, where those other fiends, made drunk with too much alcohol, raised a violent uproar. Argument and quarrelling for the mastery followed, and De Soto was not long in obtaining the mastery. The mate could not resist, and the jealousy of the former was impossible to be constrained. So, determined to have what he desired, this avaricious De Soto, in one act, made his own position doubly secure. Hitherto he had aided the mate. Now he was going to end all that, and as the mate lay in his drunken sleep, De Soto put a pistol to the man's head and shot away his life. His next step was to conciliate the crew. He pointed out to them that he had done this deed for their benefit, and declared that he was now their leader, and promised them every success, provided they should obey him. And, as a mob always is swayed by the strongest character, the crew hailed him as their captain with acclamation and unanimity. As to the slaves, these poor creatures were confined below under the hatches, and De Soto steered for the West Indies, where he sold them at a good price, reserving one of them, a boy, as his servant. They then proceeded to act the lives of ordinary pirates, plundering many a fine vessel. But, bad as other pirates were, there is little or nothing to choose between the atrocities of this present crew and those others of which the Moslem corsairs already narrated were guilty. De Soto and his associates were devils incarnate, and it is past the wit of man ever to imagine such a gang should have been allowed to mix with human beings. I have no intention of detailing all their abominable doings, but in order to convey some idea of the lengths to which they could go, the following will be found sufficiently indicative. A certain American brig had the misfortune to fall into their hands. From her they took all the valuables they could lay their hands upon, and then they sent all the people below, fastened the hatches, and set the brig on fire. One man, a Negro, they had allowed to be accepted. Him they kept on deck for the villainous pleasure of seeing the man tortured. Having hove to, the pirate ship watched the flames tearing through the brig, bursting up the decks and penetrating everywhere. Now it climbed the rigging, and the monsters laughed with joy to see the poor nigger leaping from rope to rope till he climbed even to the masthead, and presently fell therefrom, exhausted, into the roaring furnace which filled the hold. But that was not the one solitary monstrous act in their piratical exploits, and the following is really a story in itself. Every one knows of the island called Ascension, which stands lonely in the South Atlantic, some 8 or 9 degrees below the equator. In the year 1828, a British ship named the Morning Star was homeward bound from Ceylon. That was, of course, many days prior to the opening of the Suez Canal, and in the days of oak and hemp. The Morning Star carried a valuable cargo, as well as some passengers, including a major and his wife, 2 civilians, and 25 invalid soldiers on their way to England. Some of the latter had their wives also with them. On the 21st of February, when near the island of Ascension, the Defensor de Pedro sighted the Morning Star, the 2 vessels proceeding in opposite directions. As soon as De Soto espied her, at daybreak, he summoned all hands and prepared for attack, having altered his course to give chase. At first he supposed that she was a Frenchman, but one of his crew, named Barbazan, of French nationality, assured him the ship was British. This delighted De Soto, for he guessed there would be the more booty. When the yards had been squared and the pirate ship ran before the wind, The Morning Star was about 6 miles away. The Defensor de Pedro was a fast ship, but as the other had now set a great deal more canvas, the pirate was a long time coming up to her. This made De Soto like a wild animal, pacing the deck, muttering growls and exhibiting the utmost restlessness. The delay was lashing him into a wild orgy of oaths and curses and ill temper. The crew, however, were in a savage delight at the prospect of being able to capture so rich a vessel as she appeared to be. Barbazan was busy clearing for action, and seeing that the men had breakfast and then were well armed. The captain's black servant came up to ask if he would have his morning cup of chocolate, when De Soto, in his grossly irritable impetuosity, struck the boy violently with his telescope. And if any of the crew interrupted him as he paced up and down, there was trouble for that unhappy man. But now the stunsails were set, and the Defensor de Pedro was adding to her speed so nicely that she was perceptibly gaining on the Morning Star. This relieved the great monster of a load of anxiety, so that he went below and feasted heartily on cold beef and chocolate, and then sat down to enjoy his cigar. More and more gained the pursuer on the chase, so a gun was fired, with the customary blank cartridge, and British colours hoisted. But the Morning Star still held on her way. This infuriated the pirate. "Shoot the long gun," he commanded, "and give it her point blank." This was done, but the shot fell short, and he leapt from the deck to curse his men for bungling. When nearly abreast of the British ship, De Soto aimed the gun himself and fired again as the pirate ran up Colombian colours. The people on the Morning Star were in a state of terror by now, though her captain did his best to restore confidence. Although one of his men had been wounded, yet he kept a smart press of canvas on the ship, and was resolved not to strike to a pirate. Unhappily, the weeping women and the nervous passengers prevailed upon him to heave to, for the invalid soldiers could not have made much of a resistance. De Soto was shouting through his speaking trumpet, "Lower your boat down this moment, and let your captain come on board with his papers." One of the passengers volunteered to go on board the pirate, but when the villains learnt he was not the captain, they sent him back after ill-using him, threatening that if the captain did not instantly come aboard, they would blow the Morning Star up. So the captain came off forthwith, bringing with him the second mate, 3 soldiers, and a sailor boy. De Soto was awaiting them with a cutlass near the mainmast. The mate was sent to the forecastle, and both he and the captain were immediately slain. De Soto then dispatched 6 men, including Barbazan, to row off to the Morning Star and put everyone to death. After that they were to sink her. The 6 men, each with a brace of pistols, a cutlass, and a long knife, went aboard as told. Picture these blackguards, with their Latin features degenerated and their brutal expressions positively thirsting for human blood, longing to deal death or misery right and left. Their garments consisted of a coarse cotton-checkered jacket and trousers, while their heads were covered with red woolen caps, and broad canvas waist-belts held their knives and pistols. Strong and vicious, merciless and coarse, they came aboard the Indiaman as the shrieks from the terrified women rent the sea air. As the pirates jumped on deck, they slashed about on either side, swearing and slaying at the same time. Before long there was scarcely a man left in the ship alive, though a mere handful took refuge below, while the long gun on the pirate ship was ready aimed to blow the Morning Star to splinters if any opposition were shown. When the ghastly work was finished on the deck, the rascals went about their work of pillaging. Money, plate, valuable jewels, nautical instruments, charts, Everything that was of any value was taken on deck and sent across to the Defensor. Even the clothes from the passengers' backs were torn off. The culprits then, after 2 hours' rummaging, sat down in the cabin and were served with viands and sparkling wine by a reluctant steward. Unhappily, a small piece of broken glass chanced to be found in the wine, so one of the pirates, in a fury, grasped the trembling steward by the throat, holding a pointed knife to his face. For some time they went on drinking, until the loud voice of De Soto recalled them to the ship. They had no time now to kill everyone, as had been their orders, but were content with boring holes in the hull and leaving the surviving people to drown like rats. Darkness came down over the saddened Morning Star. She presented a sight of the most poignant misery. Her decks were slippery with human blood. Her masts had been sawn off by the miscreants who had but recently left her. Her rigging had been cut away, and her holds and cabins had been pilfered and left in disorder. When at last the deathly stillness convinced the imprisoned victims that they were alone, the ladies succeeded in forcing their way out of the cabin, where they had been left imprisoned to drown. But down in the hold were the captive men, and the hatches had been secured by heavy balks of timber. The women shouted to them that the pirates had left, and then, with their united efforts, the timber was moved away and the hatches opened. At last they were restored to life. But it was not to be for long, they surmised, as they found the ship had already 6 feet of water in her. By working hard at the pumps, she was kept afloat. Yet what was the good when there were no sails or spars, and they must eventually succumb to the fatigue of pumping? With shattered nerves and wounded bodies, they were now to encounter a lingering death. But, by an act of God, the very next day they fell in with a vessel which picked them up and brought them safely back to England, where the arrival of these survivors created great excitement. But we must now return to follow De Soto and his gang. The Defensor had sailed far into the night before De Soto learned that the people in the Morning Star had not been done to death, but were only drowning. He raged like an infuriated monster robbed of its prey, cursed Barbazan, and threatened his men with death. And even now he decided to put back and look for the Morning Star. He wanted to make quite sure they were dead, and after cruising about some time, as he could see no trace of her, he concluded that she had already sunk to the depths below. Thus gratified, he headed for Europe, and on the way plundered and sunk a brig, murdering the entire crew, with the exception of one man, whom he brought aboard so that he might pilot them to Corunna, of which the stranger had special expert knowledge. And as soon as they came within near sight of the port, the pirate came up to him as the latter steered, and addressed him thus: "My friend, is this the harbor of Corunna?" "Yes," said the other. De Soto regarded him for a moment. "Then," said he, "you have done your duty well, and I am obliged to you for your services." And with that he drew his pistol and shot him dead. Then, flinging his still warm body over the ship's side, he took the steering himself, and brought his ship into Corunna after her long and wicked voyage. But the story is not yet complete. Hitherto the ungodly have prospered. Now it is their turn to suffer. After De Soto had obtained ship's papers in a false name, after he had made a brief sojourn to sell most of his booty, he set sail again for Cadiz, where he hoped to be able to market the remainder of his spoil. It was not to be a long voyage, just down the coast, round Cape St. Vincent, and so to his destination. He carried a fair wind all the way, too, until he was quite within sight of the neighbouring coastline. But as night was approaching, and he wanted daylight to go to his anchorage, he hove to till the dawn should return. But during the night the wind backed to the westward, and before long it was blowing the full force of a gale, making Cadiz a lee shore, and the whole drift of the Atlantic descend in a cruel sea. De Soto luffed his ship all he could, so as to clear a point that stretched out from the shore, but all the time he was close hauled, trying to get to windward. His ship was making a lot of leeway, and he found it impossible to claw off from the land. The weather got from bad to worse, and the night was as black as a nigger's head. To windward, the howling gale; to leeward, the sound of the breakers; and over everything, the impending doom of ship at the mercy of the wind. It was only a question of time now. The end was certain, and the Defensor struck the ground in the shallows with a dull, sickening thud. For a moment she drifted a little nearer to the shore on the top of a succeeding wave, and then down she bumped harder than ever, as her crew momentarily expected her back to be broken in twain. Aloft there was a miserable flapping of canvas and loose gear. On deck below, the men who had bullied others were now themselves craven cowards. At last their own destiny in this dark, wild night had come. So it seemed. But by providential indulgence they were allowed to remain together all night in the wrecked ship, and in the morning they were able to row ashore. No other thought had De Soto now than to sell the wreck to the highest bidder, and to purchase another craft to renew their piratical endeavours. As the night and winds had passed, so had their own fears and good resolutions, and every member of the crew was ready to go afloat again with De Soto in a new ship, if they could obtain what they wanted. They therefore proceeded to Cadiz, and presenting themselves to the authorities, Soto pretended that they were poor shipwrecked mariners, that the captain had perished, and that he himself was mate. The yarn was accepted with sympathy. As to the wreck, she was sold for the sum of £350, or, to be more accurate, the contract had been signed for that amount. But just then, fortunately, the last act of the drama began, and the plot took a new and unexpected turn. There were some inconsistencies in the accounts of the pirates' stories, so the money was not paid, and 6 of the men were arrested on suspicion. De Soto and one of the crew became alarmed, and fled from Cadiz, arriving at the neutral ground. 6 others got right away. The reader, in spite of his natural resentment of De Soto's character, cannot but admire the amazing ingenuity of the fellow, and the consummate ease with which he could always invent some new stratagem to suit his change of fortunes. And now, once more, the pirate had to set his wits to work. He carried with him a letter of credit from Cadiz, and he wished to get into Gibraltar in order to obtain money. His companion decided not to attempt such a risky proposition, and so escaped the fate which was De Soto's. By means of a false pass, De Soto obtained admission into the garrison, and then took up his abode in a certain low tavern, where he remained a few weeks, pretending to the innkeeper that he had come to Gibraltar on his way to Cadiz from Malaga, and was waiting for a friend. He dressed expensively and seemed quite happy. But after a while he was arrested and brought to court. There was plenty of evidence against him, and the pocket-book which had belonged to the captain of the Morning Star, together with certain other articles taken from that ship, were proved to have been found in De Soto's room in the tavern. Furthermore, that black boy whom he had retained from another ship, as narrated, and had been cruelly treated by De Soto, now came forward as a witness, and thus the chain of evidence was gradually completed to convict the lawless tyrant. The governor passed the sentence of death, and right up till the day of the execution the culprit still protested his innocence. But at length he was at the last moved to repentance, and if there is much to say against the man, there is to be added that in his final hour he showed amazing courage and played the man, even assisting his executioners in adjusting the halter. In the life of such a man as De Soto, there is little that can rouse one to enthusiasm. The romance of the days of piracy becomes clouded over by the horrible cruelties and unmerciful slaughter which accompanied the robberies by sea. Stripped of all its excitement and the glamour of brave deeds, such a story as that of this Dago is just one long account of avarice and its attainment. Neither divine nor human laws, neither loyalty to his superior officers, nor respect for his fellow-men, nothing did De Soto allow to stand in his way to fulfill his ambition. He plotted and schemed, he murdered and he pillaged, he fabricated falsehoods and he collected fabulous wealth. But when the net benefit to himself is reckoned up, the reader may naturally ask the question, cui bono? Whom did it benefit? Certainly not himself, and certainly not his crew. It provided a life of excitement and debauchery. It caused misery and suffering to some, and death to others. That, in a word, was the grand total of a wasted life. The pity of it is that all this wild energy, this daring, this ingenuity, this brilliant seamanship and fighting capability might not have been used to some better and more lasting purpose. End of chapter 25. Recording by Linda Johnson. Chapter 26 of The Romance of Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Romance of Piracy by Edward Keble Chatterton. Chapter 26. The Pirates of Borneo. We have seen already during the preceding chapters that there have been certain geographical spheres where piracy has been especially prevalent and persistent. Although, of course, there are some exceptions, yet, as a rule, the most suitable area is either at some spot where both sides of the land converge to make straits, such as Gibraltar or the entrance to the Red Sea, or in certain parts of the West Indies. Or the area is an archipelago, where the multiplicity of islands can be used with advantage for convenient lurking places. Of this we have excellent examples in the Aegean and Caribbean seas, each of which has been a notorious haunt for pirates. And now we come to yet another territory, which, for both of these separate reasons, has been even in our own generation a well-known sphere of murder and robbery at sea. If you look at a chart or map of the Malay archipelago, you will see how land nearly meets land at the Straits of Malacca, so that ships passing between eastern and western ports on the great highway become focused into one comparatively small area, as at the Straits of Gibraltar, thus enabling the pirates to concentrate their attention on one particular spot with every assurance of reaping their cruel harvest. But also, where the three great seas, the Indian Ocean, the China Sea, and the mighty Pacific meet, just to the north of the Australian continent, you have here a perfect maze of islands, which, in the absence of any firm authority backed by adequate sea power, are ready-made nests for the propagation of piracy and all which that term suggests. Whatever else a pirate was, he was a master of strategy, not by education but by instinct. And the situation of the Malay Peninsula, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo almost spells piracy, even if we were to be told that never in history had such a crime been hereabout perpetrated. The Malays were naturally sea rovers by habit and instinct, and their native craft, the swift-flying prahu, was particularly suited for darting out from a snug lurking place to harass the more cumbrous and slower merchant ship as she was passing over the sea. It was impossible to confine their energies to fishing or trading. Naturally warlike and roving, the convenient geographical position where they lived afforded them every opportunity of fulfilling their heart's desire. Matters have altered a good deal during the last 50 or 60 years, but about the middle of the last century, before the modern steamship liner had conquered the world's trade routes, no merchantman could voyage with safety through the region of which we are speaking. Simultaneously with the Malays, there were the Dyaks of the northwest corner of the island of Borneo, who numbered thousands of warriors. These men, using spears and swords, were induced and trained by the Malays during the 18th century to become wily pirates too. These Dyaks became expert seamen with the facilities at their disposal, and built a kind of prahu for their use called a bangkong. Joining their forces with the Malays, they were able to get together a formidable fleet of 100 or more of these craft, with which they swept the seas of any ships that might come their way, laying waste the shores of Borneo and carrying off crews as captives into slavery, just as had been done by the Moslem corsairs. One of the chief characteristics of these Dyaks was their passion for collecting human heads. It is difficult for a civilized person to understand this propensity, but head-hunting was not merely a sport, but the accumulation of heads was looked upon as the essential possessions of manhood. Now, among all the romance which centers round the splendid work which has been done in far-off countries by Englishmen as rulers and governors, as administrators and reformers, few stories are more interesting than that of the late Sir James Brooke, first Rajah of Sarawak, in the island of Borneo. Under his rule and that of his successor, Sir Charles Brooke, this barbarous custom of head-hunting, as well as the persistent piracies, have been happily put down. And in the small space which is at my disposal, I propose now to give some idea of the kind of evil which had to be tackled. In the 40s of the 19th century, the English navy was sent to act against the Malays and Dyaks of Sarabas, and it is to the interesting account, written by Captain the Honourable Henry Keble, R.N., that I am largely indebted for the following details. Although the Rajah of Sarawak had done much to banish piracy, yet he found that an intrigue was on foot to revive this crime. So, in the year 1849, we find a strong force under Captain Arthur Farquhar, R.N., consisting of H.M. sloop Royalist, the Honourable East India Company's armed steamship Nemesis, H.M. steam tender Ranee, together with a flotilla made up of the gig, pinnace, and cutter of H.M.S. Albatross. These craft were fully armed and manned by 103 officers and men. The Albatross had been sent by the British government from the China station, and while this was being done, Sir James Brooke was making every preparation for the forthcoming expedition. On the 24th of July, the SS Nemesis, together with the Royalist and the Ranee, started inland. Owing to her size and draught, the Albatross was left behind at the entrance to the river Sarawak. Following astern of the other craft were towed 3 of the Albatross's boats, 3 from the Nemesis and the Royalist's cutter. In addition to these, there were also brought 18 native craft, the Rajah being in his new prahu. A little later, and this expedition was also joined by the Orang Kaya of Lundu, with 300 men in prahus of various sizes. and presently, too, the Linga Dyaks and others, about 800 strong, came with their help, so that eventually there were altogether 2,500 men ready and keen to meet the pirates. The reader will wish to know, before we proceed further, some details concerning the prahu. She is one of the fastest vessels in the world propelled by sail. Measuring no less than 90 feet, with about 9 feet beam, pulling about 80 oars in 2 tiers, she was manned by 100 men. Over the oarsmen was a light, strong, flat roof of thin strips of bamboo, covered with matting to protect the ammunition and provisions from the rain, and also to serve as a platform from which she could fire the rifles or hurl spears. The rowers used to sit cross-legged on a shelf, and they could get a wonderful speed on to their craft. 6 swivel guns were mounted on either side, and 30 rifles were also carried, so that one can quite easily imagine that such a craft, with a score more like her, could inflict almost any harm they liked on a trading ship becalmed. The Dyak Bangkongs, which were very similar to these, drew very little water, so were able to creep into shallow hiding places. Propelled by their 80 paddles, these craft, with their overhanging bow and stern, were so noiseless in their approach, and so stealthy in their movement, so easily capable of darting to and fro, that no wonder they became a terror to all commercial shipping. It was customary for these pirates, when attacked, to rush back up the river into the jungle, rather than to stand out to sea. For they knew how to hide themselves in the thickets, and as to the prahu, they could either conceal that by hauling her ashore, or else destroy her. Very difficult, therefore, was the task of dealing with these artful fellows, and the wisdom of taking so many boats and craft similar to those of the enemy is quickly apparent. Sometimes the pirates would try to run out to sea when no other course was left, but this was rare. Very useful did the fast-pulling boats of the punitive expedition prove for keeping a lookout and signaling the approach of the enemy. For now the expedition had arrived at the spot where they were to wait. It was known that the pirates were coming along with 150 prahus, and that they had the great chiefs of the Malays to help them. After capturing trading vessels loaded with sago and cotton goods, they had come along the river with the strong flood tide. Between them and the main body of the punitive expedition were the latter's scouts waiting anxiously in the darkness of the night to give the warning. Suddenly a rocket went hissing up into the sky and lit up the dark arc of heaven. This was the signal from the scouts that the enemy were approaching. They came on in 2 divisions, whilst the Rajah's fleet behind the scouts were guarding the breadth of the river. The hot tide was bringing the rival forces nearer and nearer, but as soon as the pirates, peering through the night, outlined the form of a steamer, they began to be nervous, for here was a craft at last superior to their own. The first firing had taken place when they came in touch with the expedition's scouts in man-of-war's boats, and then the discharge of musketry became fiercer and fiercer, so that it was not long before the pirates, in spite of all their strength, were thrown utterly into confusion. During the fighting it was difficult to tell foe from friend, but the happy arrangement had been made of the expedition's boats burning blue lights. And what with these dotted about the dark river, what with the glare of the rockets, the cheers of the bluejackets, the discharge of musketry, and the defiant yells of the pirate, it was a most impressive night. It was not long before the enemy realized that his chances were hopeless. No fewer than 80 Bangkongs were run on shore, while some others tried to escape down the river and out to sea. 17 of the larger prahus, in avoiding a shoal, attempted to pass the steamer, and so were destroyed forthwith. The pirates lost very heavily, whereas our casualties were but slight, though when bluejackets were humanely endeavoring to rescue pirates struggling in the water from drowning, the rescuers were viciously attacked, as the half-drowned creatures could not comprehend this consideration for human life. When morning came, there were found no fewer than 60 deserted prahus, in addition to a quantity of debris on the beach. As many as 2,500 of the enemy had hurriedly dashed their craft ashore and fled into the jungle. Our men had captured or destroyed 88 of this fleet, or over one half of the 150 which had set out, and from 500 to 800 of the pirates had been killed. Our losses were nil, and only a few men wounded in trying to prevent these men sinking with sword and shield still in their wicked hands. It had been a well-organized attack from our side, and the spot just by the entrances of the rivers Kaluka and Sarabas had been well chosen. The enemy had been thoroughly terrified from first to last. As he had come up with the flood tide and realized the strength of the expedition, he had lost his senses completely and become obsessed with no other idea than to get out of it as quickly as he could. So, having dealt Piracy a very severe blow, the expedition spent a couple of days securing prisoners and destroying captured boats. Then, on the 2nd of August, the fleet proceeded up the Sarabas River and anchored near the entrance of the Pacu branch. Here it became necessary, owing to the nature of the river, to leave the Nemesis and the heaviest prahus behind. But the lighter boats and the captured Bangkongs continued the advance, the small steamer Rani and the men-of-war's boats going on ahead. Astern came several hundred of the native boats, all eager for plunder. But the rushing tide swept them all together in confusion, and meanwhile, during this medley, a tree branch overhanging the river got athwart the Rani and swept away her funnel. Simultaneously, she got aground forward, and, her stern being free, she was carried right across the river by the current. Steam was let off in the usual manner, and this noise, so strange and awe-inspiring to the natives, caused them so much terror that some of them jumped into the water. Others leapt into other boats, thus swamping them, while the remainder resigned themselves pathetically to their fate. It was a ludicrous sight, but comprehensible. As the enemy had felled so many trees into the water to bar the progress of the expedition, it became necessary, before attempting further procedure, to send a party of Dyaks on land in order to clear away these obstacles. The rest of the journey was quite easy. The fleet anchored and took Pacu, and, having wooded the steamer with her necessary fuel, the expedition once more proceeded up the alligator-infested river till they came to the mouth of the Kanawit, up which no European had yet ascended. It was now found impossible for the steamer to get farther, so only the lighter boats with their 2,000 men now advanced, their instructions being to punish the guilty but to spare those who surrendered. Slow progress was made against a strong stream, and this had given the inhabitants time to realize that trouble was approaching. For it was presently discovered that they had hurriedly left, and before doing so had burnt down their farmhouses. But in the ruins of these were ample evidences of the amazing collections of human heads which these men had made. These Sakarans had never expected that a big force of 2,000 Malays and Dyaks, led by a European Rajah and a few English, would have penetrated 100 miles into the interior. But, as the expedition had taught them a salutary lesson, it refrained from touching one of these natives, and presently the return journey was begun. Back this miscellaneous fleet went, with cotton fields, sugar cane, and cocoa-nut trees growing on either hand, and with plenty of pigs and poultry in evidence. Finally, the expedition returned home in safety. It had been a great success and made a deep impression on the natives, not merely in respect of its display of strength, but in its humane dealings with those who were alive. This latter characteristic caused especial surprise. The fines which were now levied were applied to reward the captors or prisoners who had been caught without being injured. Only a few years before this firm action, no European merchant ship had ventured on the northwest coast of Borneo, and those which had previously risked coming had paid for their temerity. It was asserted by Lloyd's that within a space of only a dozen years, no fewer than 30 or 40 square-rigged craft had been captured, plundered, or in some way molested by these pirates, and the European crews murdered. But this successful expedition also had an indirect effect, for before long many piratical chiefs came to the Rajah and made a pledge that they would never engage in piracy again. The admissions of these men sufficiently indicated the extent of the depredations. Within 8 months, admitted one ex-pirate, 3 large fleets had sailed from the Sarabas on piratical cruises. Their object was to take plunder and heads on sea, and they made a point of attacking all they were likely to overcome. Chinese, Malay fishermen, merchants, it made no difference. These pirates, it was proved, did not engage in trade, but whenever they stood in need of money or slaves, they went pirating. "We have no friends when at sea," remarked one of these corsairs on oath. They would attack towns and lay them waste simply for 2 motives: love of plunder and the desire to collect heads. As illustrative of their recognizing no friends at sea, the following instance may here be cited. On a certain occasion, a prahu was attacked off the coast by 2 other prahus. "Why are you attacking your friends?" inquired the first. The answer came quite candidly. "At home we make a distinction between friends and enemies, but at sea everybody we kill and plunder." With such views on the subject and such deeply rooted bias towards piracy, it was hardly to be expected that the neighborhood would remain free from this nuisance for all time. By the year 1862, the pirates had become so daring that they attacked quite large craft. A Spanish steamer and gunboat had had some smart encounters, but they had sunk 2 prahus and their crews. They had also bombarded a pirate stronghold and rescued 21 Christian Indian natives, as well as 12 Javanese Malays. And the Spanish steamer had run down 15 more prahus, one after the other, on their way to Borneo. And there is still preserved a copy of a letter written in that year by Rajah Brooke to say that on 27th May 1862, while lying at anchor in his steam yacht, the Rainbow, a boat came alongside, giving information that 6 large pirate craft were passing along the coast, having killed several people and taken many captives. Even this very boat which had brought the message had barely escaped. So the Rainbow and a gunboat were immediately prepared for action, and steamed out over the bar, the Bishop of Labuan being on board at the time. At daylight one morning, 3 of the enemy were discovered from the masthead 7 or 8 miles to seaward. Chase was now at once given, and the prahus were seen to be crowded with men. It was now clearly their object to get ashore if possible before the Rainbow should get up with them. The leading craft actually did so succeed, and ran herself onto the rocks at Cadrong Point. The Rainbow stood as near inshore as she could, and while steaming in 2 fathoms, the pirates fired on her from their muskets. This fire was now returned with interest, and after 10 minutes' cannonade, the survivors, as usual, disappeared into the jungle. The Rainbow now attacked the other 2 boats, one of which she ran down. The other was captured and brought alongside, full of men, women, and children, whom the pirates had taken as prisoners. These were brought on board, and the wounded attended by the bishop. From one boat alone there were taken 1 Spanish and 5 Dutch flags, which showed doubtless as many acts of piracy. Shortly after, the remaining 3 pirate prahus were found at sea and eventually destroyed, though one of them made a most desperate fight, killing and wounding several of the Rainbow's complement, and they even continued to fight when in the water. The Rainbow took 30 on board, who were pinioned and placed in the hold. The poor captives were found to be nearly starved. The pirates had treated them most cruelly, having given them salt water to drink, and for the first few weeks had disabled them by beating their knees and elbow joints with bamboos. Thus, civilization, good administration, and a determination to oust these sea robbers and murderers have to be thanked for doing a sound work not merely to individuals, but to ships and commerce generally. If ever there were any men who may unquestionably be set down as universal enemies of the human race, certainly they are the brigands on shore and the pirates afloat. End of chapter 26. Recording by Linda Johnson. Chapter 27 of The Romance of Piracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Romance of Piracy by Keble CHATTERTON. Chapter 27. Cruising Among Chinese Pirates. Perhaps it will be a long time before the last of the Chinese pirates can assuredly be said to have gone. We know too well that if a liner ever happens to get ashore in this neighborhood, she stands a grave risk of being looted and losing some of her people by murder. Things have indubitably altered for the better, but in the 60s and 70s, the coasts of China were infested with pirates, especially to the southward. At that time, when so many fine tea clippers and other sailing ships were passing and repassing full of such valuable cargoes, just prior to the time when the steamship was altering matters and the Suez Canal was about to be opened, there was what we may rightly call the grand period of Chinese piracy, and the following incidents were taken part in by Captain H.C. St. John, R.N., who was sent to keep these pests in check at this time. I wish to acknowledge my indebtedness to this officer's notes of these events, which were subsequently published. One day, whilst at anchor in his gunboat in Hong Kong harbor, there happened to be lying close by a fine large opium junk. She was armed with no less than a dozen 12 to 18-pounders and carried 45 men. During the afternoon, a number of passengers went aboard her, and at dusk she got under way and cleared out. But as soon as she had reached the outer roads of Hong Kong, it fell a flat calm, so that she was compelled to anchor about 9 p.m. About midnight another large junk ran quietly alongside, and some of her crew jumped on board the opium craft. In a short space of time, the pirates' crew had seized both passengers and crew of the Hong Kong craft and placed them below hatches. The pirate then got under way and steered for the south side of Hong Kong. On the way thither, soon after daylight, the unfortunate prisoners were one by one brought on deck by the pirates, and first their hands were tied behind their backs, then their feet were fastened together, and they were then thrown overboard. This treatment happened to all, 83 of them, with the exception of one, a boy 12 years old. Him the pirates spared, as he would be useful for making their tea and preparing their opium pipes. The pirates had taken this cargo of opium, for they knew how valuable it was and how easily sold it could be. They then made for their harbor, near to Macao, where they divided their spoil. 7 of them then took the boy with them and proceeded to Macao, from where they went by steamer, bound for Hong Kong, a little farther on. During this steamer trip, the captain of the vessel noticed that the youngster was in great distress, and questioned him. In a few minutes the captain realized that among his passengers were 7 pirates, and determined to have them arrested. So, instead of taking his steamer as usual alongside the jetty at Hong Kong, he anchored in midstream and hailed the police boat to come out to him. The latter arrived, and then the 100-odd Chinese passengers were lined up, and the boy was told to pick out the 7 pirates. This he succeeded in doing, and the police took them ashore and locked them up. Now, it happened that the evening previous to this, someone else had arrived in Hong Kong and told a similar story. This was one of the 83 who had been thought dead. For this fellow, on finding himself in the water, had managed with a desperate struggle to release his hands by slipping through the lashing which bound them. And then, when he came up to the surface of the water, he succeeded in releasing his feet. He was thus able to swim to the nearest island, and from there made his way to Hong Kong in a fishing boat. It was a true but remarkable story, and the evidence of the boy coming on the top of this made the case against the 7 pirates so clean that they were tried at Hong Kong, found guilty, and subsequently hanged. On another occasion, this British gunboat was cruising up the coast on the lookout for pirates, when, on passing a small island, 2 fishermen paddled off in a sampan and pointed out a couple of small junks that were standing out to sea. Knowing that as the wind was absent there could be no escape, the gunboat steamed quietly on. Presently, about a dozen other smaller junks put off and opened fire on the 2 junks which had first been seen. But the gunboat, now running alongside the latter, captured them, took their crews on board prisoners, and then steamed in towards the town and let go anchor. The local mandarin now came off and expressed his thanks for having captured these 2 junks and 21 men. The incident had caused tremendous delight, as the craft had been giving a great deal of trouble recently, and no local junks had dared to come out. But what was surprising was that 7 had not dared to tackle 2 larger than themselves, and yet it is said that the Chinese are no cowards. I mentioned just now that this was the time of the famous tea clippers, which used to make such marvelously fast voyages from China to London. Now, one day, whilst one of these clippers was on her way down the China Sea, she was becalmed. Shortly after, apparently bringing a faint breeze with them, appeared 15 junks with their large sails. They opened fire on the helpless clipper from just within range, and everything looked as if the junk fleet would soon capture the clipper. But, as everyone knows, these clipper ships were famous for 2 things: the beauty of their hulls and the enormous mountain of canvas which they could set. Consequently, the combination of a fine-lined hull with a light and lofty sail spread could be used in a light air to give an advantage over the heavy junk with her equally heavy sails. And as the breeze now strengthened a little, the clipper was able by the narrowest of margins to draw right away and escape. Captain St. John was now sent to capture these junks. After steaming through a lovely starlit night, the gunboat arrived with the dawn by the first of the islands which fringe the coastline just to the west of the Canton River. It was then noticed that there was 1 junk well inshore and some miles ahead. The weather was quite calm, and her bat-winged sails were flapping uselessly in the ocean swell. Presently there were signs of activity observed, and a boat was launched from the junk with a dozen men who pulled for the shore as quickly as human muscles could impel the craft. But they were useless against the steam gunboat, which managed to cut in and arrest both boat and junk The latter was then taken in tow by the gunboat, with 24 pirates on board, who were soon handed over to the governor of the nearest province. So that put an end to their activities for the present. And a curious thing was noticed when the junk was being examined. It was seen that the sails of the craft had holes in them, and the shape of these suggested that they had been made as the result of somebody's cannonade. Later on it was learned that this was not originally a pirate junk, but a trader, which had the bad luck to be captured by Chinese pirates 3 months previously after killing the crew. Those in the gunboat remembered as they were approaching this junk that the pirates were busily heaving bags of something overboard as fast as they could. You may imagine with what emotions they discovered later that these were bags of dollars. The sum of £4,000 had been found on board the junk when the pirates took her, and although they had done their best to throw as much overboard as they could, rather than see it fall into the hands of the British ship, there still remained about £2,000 of this amount when the gunboat took her in tow. The prisoners were sent on to Canton and executed for their piracy, though 7 were allowed to escape before Canton was reached. In the year 1875, an English brigantine was sailing to the northward past the Chinese coast when, about 100 miles from Hong Kong, they were attacked by pirates who promptly killed the captain and ship's boy. The rest of the crew went aloft and remained on the top until the pirates below had finished ransacking the ship. After a terrible suspense, wondering who was to die next, the crew watched the Chinamen leave the ship and return to their junk. So the Englishmen came down from their lofty perch to the deck, and without further excitement, they navigated their craft into port and gave information against the pirates. But it was not always an easy matter to locate these cunning creatures, who were as artful as they were cruel. But the following incident shows how cleverly the English navy could grapple with a difficult problem. In some respects, the story is a kind of nautical detective tale and is well worth relating. It happened one day that while the gunboat was coaling, information was brought to Captain St. John that a large fishing junk belonging to Hong Kong, with her owner and his Chinese family on board, had been attacked by pirates whilst the innocent vessel had been engaged in her lawful fishing at sea. The owner had been sent adrift in a sampan, his junk taken from him together with his 3 daughters. He was ordered to make his way as best he could to the shore, and there collect $500 from his friends if he wished to obtain his daughters' release. He was advised not to be too long about it, as otherwise the girls would be put to death. The harassed Chinamen had got to land and at length came aboard the British gunboat. So, after the latter had finished coaling, she got under way at dusk and made good progress towards the cluster of islands about 30 miles away from Hong Kong. And now began a series of interesting events based on deductive and inductive reasoning to outwit Oriental cunning. Arrived at this island cluster, the commander well knew that he was in the very center of the favorite resort of pirates. The channel ran between the islands, and on either side were numerous little coves where the junks could easily withdraw and yet as easily get away again. Having reached this district before dawn, just as the darkness was sweeping away, there was seen a junk moving cautiously in the shadows of the cliff towards the farther entrance. This was certainly suspicious, so the gunboat stood in, bided her time, and presently caught the junk, although the latter's crew had escaped to the shore. It was a great piece of luck to have lighted upon this craft in such a manner, for the Chinamen, whom the gunboat had brought with her, immediately recognized her as the very junk which had run off with his daughters. The gunboat's voyage was now becoming exciting, and a little farther on she was passing another cove when another junk hove in sight. The gunboat went in pursuit, but the Chinamen, nervous for their lives, ran the junk ashore, and her crew of 12 made off into the bushes. After some little effort, the junk was relaunched from her sandy bed and got afloat again, and you may judge of the joy of the Chinaman on the gunboat when he realized that this was his own junk in which he was fishing when the pirates had come to attack him. So she also was now taken in tow. So far, so good. Both junks had been found and taken in tow by the gunboat. But even if the pirates were not likely to be captured, yet the fishermen's daughters had still to be found. Even the guns which had been taken by the pirates from the fishing craft were found, after a little searching, buried in the sand quite close to the junk. So the gunboat proceeded along till she arrived at the head of a bay, where lay a town almost concealed by a woody point, and here the British craft let go anchor, whilst her commander played very cleverly the part of detective. He began by bluntly demanding the deliverance of the 3 girls. This was met with blank astonishment. The townspeople pretended with typical Oriental manner that they knew nothing about the girls. They were completely innocent of all knowledge concerning them. This fervent assurance might possibly have convinced some Europeans, but Captain St. John was far too experienced in the ways of the crafty Chinese to believe a word they said. He had every reason to suppose that the girls were in this town, near which he had found the 2 junks, and he was determined to obtain the object of his mission. Therefore, having been met with this protestation of innocence, he insisted on the 3 headmen of the village being sent on board the gunboat. They came in their silk robes, and, accompanied by a couple of bluejackets, proceeded to the man-of-war. Preparations were now made on the gunboat's deck for hanging the 3 Chinamen. A good deal of ostentatious activity was spent in passing a rope from each masthead and tying knots, arranging nooses suitable for the heads of these 3 men. The intention of the commander was to frighten the Chinamen into submission, for he was convinced they were lying. For a time, these efforts had not the desired effect, and one at least of these 3 Orientals even laughed satirically at the arrangements. But when the nooses of rope were put over the head of each, the effect was magical. So soon as the rope touched their yellow skin, their manner was altered, and their memories suddenly awoke from their untruthful stupor. Yes, the Chinamen now recollected that the girls were indeed in the village, and if only the commander would spare the lives of these 3 headmen, the girls should be returned in safety. So directions were sent to the village, and before long the girls appeared on the beach, escorted by crowds. The 3 headmen were then exchanged for the 3 girls, and the gunboat once more got under way. The ship's company made them as comfortable as possible, wrapping them up in a sail for the night, and feeding them with all the tea and jam which their Oriental palates delighted in. To the great joy of their father, they were brought safely back to Hong Kong, and the incident, thanks to Captain St. John's clever stratagem and determination, had been brought to a happy issue. The part which the British Navy has played in Chinese waters alone in putting down piracy has been considerable. Sometimes the efforts have had to be made against superior numbers, and only British pluck and cleverness could have brought about the results which followed. Such an occasion occurred when this same gunboat once rounded a headland in these seas, and after opening up the channel, found no fewer than 15 junks drawn up in line in such a manner as to command the center of the channel with their guns. The navigation hereabouts was tricky, especially for a vessel drawing as much water as the gunboat. But she was taken full speed through the soft mud on to the north side, so that she kept all the junks end on and not broadside. This somewhat surprised the junks, who were still more amazed when the gunboat, with her guns out and ready loaded, dashed into the middle of them before ever a shot had been fired by either side. Indeed, so terrified were these Chinamen that they jumped overboard and swam from their craft to the shore, where they presently manned their land batteries. But before they had fired, the gunboat had come to anchor and sent a shot against them. This had the salutary effect of clearing the Chinamen from their new stronghold. Then the English officer followed this up by landing the whole of his men, with the exception of 3, plus the Chinese portion of his crew. He came ashore with his men some little distance below the position the Chinese pirates had taken up, as the ground was less unsuitable. His force consisted only of 20 bluejackets and marines all told. The enemy amounted to 300 or 500. Forming in single file, the English advanced towards the pirates, but a minute later the enemy hesitated and then fled for their lives. Although the difference in the strength of the two forces was so great, yet the result of the encounter was instant and unmistakable. All that the English had now to do was to walk into the battery from behind and burn the village. This, together with the blowing up of 3 junks, was readily accomplished. So the Englishmen returned aboard their gunboat, and just then they espied a whole fleet of junks steering into the creek. The gunboat's Chinese interpreter assured himself that these were pirates, so another engagement was imminent. But in a short time it was found that they were the opposite of pirates. In fact, these junks belonged to a certain mandarin who assured the gunboat's commander that he would not have dared to have come into the channel had he not seen the British gunboat there lying. For the mandarin had been living in terror of these corsairs. However, the gunboat was in a hurry, and had no more time to waste over these pirates. So, handing over the junks to the mandarin, and leaving the devastated town in the latter's charge, the man-of-war got up her anchor and made for Macao. After leaving Macao, the gunboat steamed some miles to the west and then turned sharply to the right, thus approaching the mainland, which was separated from the chain of islands by a dozen miles of shallow muddy water. As she was proceeding, the gunboat grounded, the time being about low water, and no further advance could be made. Heavy clouds were coming up, and presently dirty weather set in. The water became lashed into a nasty short sea, and the wind increased in violence. At this moment, from amidst the heavy driving rain, there emerged a junk, tearing before the breeze with her great sails boomed out. Here was a stroke of ill luck, to have this pirate coming out just as the gunboat was immovable and unable to work her guns freely. However, the best had to be made of a bad job. So a big shot was pitched across the bows of the hurrying junk, which she ignored. In another minute the big gun would not be able to bear on her, and she would have dashed past, and would have been able to rake with her guns the helpless gunboat stranded in the mud. It was now or never, and the order to fire into her had just been given, but before the trigger had been pulled, down came the great sail of the junk, and in a very few minutes she had rounded to and anchored close to the man-of-war. Just then, too, the tide had risen a little, so that the gunboat was able to float off and dropped astern into deeper water. The junk was then boarded, and found to contain 43 men. These, in small parties, were now sent aboard the gunboat and secured for the night. The next day the gunboat and her junk arrived at the nearest Mandarin station, where both junk and crew were handed over. She was found to be a pirate, very heavily armed, and was the identical craft against which the gunboat had been sent out. With her 8 big cannon, she was capable of doing any damage she liked against a merchant ship. In fact, she was so big a craft that she made the gunboat look quite small when alongside her. The 60s and 70s, which have been selected for our narrative to afford characteristic episodes of Chinese piracy, were the very climax of the sea robberies by which those waters became so notorious. Hong Kong itself was a veritable hotbed of piracy. Here resided the headmen of the pirate gangs, and in this selfsame harbor pirate junks had the audacity and impudence to anchor even close to a British gunboat whose mission it was to exterminate this class of nuisance. A favorite practice was for a pirate to wait in harbor till he saw another merchant junk getting under way bound for a coasting voyage. The pirate would then get his anchor up also, and follow the other junk round the first headland, when he would attack her, board her, and rob her, with or without murder, as suited his convenience. But this evil practice was largely overcome by the introduction of a system of compulsory registration, which caused the junks to be numbered. And, additional to this, the Chinamen were prevented from entering Hong Kong without a passport. And let us now close this story of pirates with the narrative of an incident which showed yet again that the white man was more than a match for the cunning and often cowardly Mongolian. Information had been received from some fishermen that 3 large junks were anchored in a snug bay 6 miles away. The gunboat's commander was well aware that the pirates scented his coming, and they did not fail to realize that the exceedingly narrow and shallow entrance was quite unsuitable for the gunboat. However, there were other means for attaining the same object, and this is what happened. The man-of-war was taken as near as she could safely float to the rocky shore. Then Captain St. John, with 7 men, quietly left his ship and rowed ashore, the gunboat having orders now to steam on and appear off the entrance to the bay as close as practicable, and to send another boat to the assistance of the 8 when the gunboat should reach her position. Captain St. John and his 7 men had barely 300 yards of bushes and grass to traverse before the low ridge overlooking the bay was reached. Then it was found that they were within 100 yards of the spot where the junks lay below them. These craft were clearly aground in the middle of the bay, and broadside on to the entrance. 2 of them were very fine vessels, mounting 10 guns, though the third was smaller. There were about 20 men in each, and, at any rate, the enemy numbered about 10 to 1 of the naval men. The Chinese had expected that the English would row round the point, and so the wily Orientals had trained their guns, ready loaded, straight for the entrance, and it had never occurred to them that their enemy would make an overland attack. Now, lying hauled out of the water on the beach in front of the houses was a sampan, and when the party of 7 got down to the beach, 3 of them launched this sampan and pushed off to the junks, while the rest were on the beach. These tactics so surprised the Chinamen that they jumped and tumbled into their boats alongside the junks, and some of them fell spluttering into the water. One of the boats from the gunboat now came on to assist, and the pirate craft were quickly taken possession of. The junks were destroyed, some of the pirates were killed, while the rest of them fled into the bushes. Thus, with a little force and much sound judgment and daring, another nest of pirates had been got rid of to the further benefit of mankind. And so we bring our story of the rise and growth of piracy to an end. Within the number of pages here afforded, it has been impossible to do more than indicate both the historic outline of the subject and to illustrate this with real, actual events of the most interesting character. A complete history of piracy will never be written. Such a task would be impossible, for the reason that all records of many of the most notorious pirates perished with themselves. In the lives of even those of whom we have certain knowledge, there are gaps about which history is silent. Perhaps those were the periods when they were enjoying their ill-gotten gains on land. Perhaps in those times they were engaged in still more daring sorts of piracy. We cannot tell. But one thing I believe to be certain, and in this any reader who has perused this volume will, I trust, agree with me. However charming and romantic a story the novelist may weave for us concerning these bold sea robbers and pillagers, yet it is not necessary to overstep the limits of actual occurrence in order to demonstrate at once the daring, the ingenuity, and the undoubtedly clever seamanship of these lawless wanderers and enemies of the human race. End of chapter 27. Recording by Linda Johnson. End of The Romance of Piracy by Edward Keble Chatterton.